Hello everyone. Hello, how are you all doing? Hope you're all having a good time. Let's see. Right. Now, before I start, I have to say something. I have a note. Mainly to myself. I want to start today. Hello everyone. We all here? Well, all joining. I want to start by saying hi to Brad Pittler, and thank you very much for him and his high point lines he's done on some of the previous talks. That's very kind of Brad to do that, and thank you very much to him for doing it. I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who is subscribing, who is liking the videos and all this stuff, because that is really, really helpful. Because as you know, I'm in this for familial bragging rights. If I can get to 1,000, I get to do my I won dance at my aunt. Now, I'm not so egotistically, I'd love to get to 1,000 by the end of April, but I'm not that silly. Yes, Brad, it's Pittler, Pittler, if I've got it right. Anyway, he's very nicely done a high points review of one of the other videos, going through what I've said and some of the points, and it's really, really kind of him. So I wanted to say thank you to him. Thank you for all the people who are patrons as well. That's really kind of you. That money is going to go towards my next research trips. So basically, the money is just going to be stored, and then when I have to go off traveling around the country to various archives, that's what it's going to cover. Right then. So today's topic is rather appropriately naval aviation. And I say appropriate because of yesterday's discussion and today's post from warships. By the way, I have occasionally written for this magazine in the past. I think they've got about 5 articles sitting from me in folder, waiting to come out at the right moment. So God knows when they'll appear. But anyway, today we are discussing naval aviation, and we're discussing the interwar years. The reason we're doing the interwar years is because I decided to do a special on Sunday, which is going to focus on World War II sort of period and on what happened then. And the reason is there's just so much. There's so much quality and stuff which needs to be looked at. I want to try and break it up. Now, so I'm also going to admit I'm going to be cheating a little bit today. I have got my PhD appendices sitting next to me because they have every single aircraft of naval aviation designed in the 1920s and 30s, all their specifications and their actual statistics in there. Part of the stuff I compiled for my PhD, about 130,000 individual data points collected to provide 6 different appendices to take the entire of naval aviation development in the 1920s and 30s down into one PhD thesis. It was a nightmare. It did leave me crying a lot, and there is a reason why naval aviation I am slowly getting back to. The trauma has only just left. So, this is a Fairey Flycatcher, and this is HMS Hermes. Now, HMS Hermes is the first aircraft carrier ever designed as such, but she's not the first launched. The first launched is Hosho of the Japanese Navy. Now, why is that interesting? Because the Japanese Navy, of course, get their details from the Royal Navy. And they're all starting in 1918 from pretty much the base point, from the same point. And by the way, if anyone would like to see these pictures and other pictures, they're going to be coming along in terms of what you're going to be getting. They're going to be coming along on the Twitter. Sorry. I think that was Eagle, not Hermes. No, this is Eagle. Before you start saying they look very similar, they do look, they are similar. They are very, very similar. Hi Ian. Hi everyone who's joined us now. They do look, Hermes and Eagle do look similar, but that is Hermes, I'm fairly sure. If it isn't, then my notes from my PhD are wrong, and we're not going to go back and re-examine those. Okay? So, Force A1, don't scare me. I might have to later. Now, I have got some books. If you're interested in this area, I just want to cover them quickly. These books, they are huge. They are written mostly by, this one is written by a guy called Ray Sturviant. And this is also written by, there's a guy called KG Mecoms and E.B. Morgan. And they are excellent. Yeah. Hermes enclosed bow, Eagle open bow. Yeah. That's the fun times for them. Anyway, both are pretty much designed at the same time off the same plan. It's just Hermes is built from the up, and Eagle is, we are taking this Chilean battleship and we are going to convert her. And after that, the Royal Navy goes, we never want to try and convert a battleship ever again. That was a nightmare. So that's why Furious, Glorious, and Courageous are the ones picked to be converted. They're battle cruisers. They have less armour. It's less painful. The Americans don't learn the lesson and do Lexington and Saratoga. And afterwards they're going, never again. Converting a battleship to an aircraft carrier. So, the Royal Navy have a massively unfair advantage in the 1920s and 1930s. They have this thing. This thing. And they have these three. They also have something called HMS Argus, which I will get back to later. They have a lot more aircraft carriers than anyone else does, so they managed to start experimenting and starting developing what they're going to do. And thinking about what they're going to do is quite a big thing for the Royal Navy. Remember when we were discussing last week, we were talking about the fact that Britain had to fight a global war, that it was looking at an entire world of potential hurt, that it wanted to protect all of this. This makes it start thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And how do aircraft carriers get involved? This actually causes some very interesting aircraft development, and actually these are what I'm going to use to talk through most of the talk. My little aircraft development charts. Now, please note, I do use the phrase some here. There is a reason I use the phrase some. The Royal Navy hops around aircraft like there's no tomorrow. They find that aircraft are quite cheap at this time, and you can start mucking around with them, and you can chop and change, and it's brilliant. It's especially brilliant when you have one little advantage of the system as set up under the rule when the RAF takes over the Royal Naval Air Service. So, the system is, the Royal Navy says they want something, so it goes from the Royal Navy's sort of operational units to the 3rd Sea Lord, who takes care of procurement. It goes from him to the Air Ministry. It goes from the Air Ministry to the Royal Air Force. It goes from the Royal Air Force back to the Air Ministry. It goes from the Air Ministry to the companies, and then the companies develop it, and then it goes all the way back, and that's how the information flows. It's fun times had by all. But what it really means for the Royal Navy as a little advantage in the early 1920s. The RAF has to do all the paperwork. It's brilliant. Yay! When the RAF has to do all the paperwork, the Royal Navy's very happy. And in the beginning, actually, the system works quite well. There is a lot of the RNAS left in the Royal Air Force, and at this point, they aren't quite as obsessed with the heavy bombers. And please note that when the RAF gets really obsessed with the heavy bombers, it's never really the RAF, it's more the Air Ministry which gets obsessed. And the Air Ministry gets obsessed with them, and they neglect their own fighters as well as the Royal Navy's aircraft, because nothing is as important as the bombers, because the bombers are what's going to win wars. Were the carriers limited by any of the treaties? The carriers were limited by all of the treaties banned home in different ways and different points. The first treaties limit them. They have to be more than 10,000 tons. They have to be this, and they have limited types of limited types of of their terms of guns and things they can carry. Is it the RNRI that pays for planes? Technically, it comes from the RN's budget. That is true. But the RN has another winning weasel on this, because the RAF are the ones who have to pay up front for it out of their budget, and then the RN pays them back when they get delivery. The RN really... The traditional thing, and I do, in my own thesis, I point out the troms of this, and my thesis basically comes down to the idea that you have the problem is for the Royal Navy when it comes to developing aircraft, is that because there's such a big disconnect between them and the engineers who say what's possible, they don't really know what's possible, so they're just ordering a slight improvement of the same thing again. And we'll get into this further. But when it comes to the paperwork and paying for the aircraft side of it, it's actually quite useful for the Royal Navy to have the Air Ministry in on the act. Did that have any effect on the planes? Well, let's start off with these beautiful creatures. These are all the aircraft. These are aircraft with spotter in their techniques. Now, this will actually flash up in a few minutes on my Twitter feed, so if you want it, go to @AC_naval history and it will be there. I think it's set for about 35 minutes past, so it's about 20 minutes in. The reason is I spread them out so that one came up every 5 minutes rather than all coming up at the same time. Anyway, so you start off, you have the Fairey 3D. Now, please note, when I'm talking about the Fairey 3 aircraft, I could be talking about the Fairey 3A, B, C, D, E, or F. All of them enter naval service, and at one point, 4 different variants are in service at the same time, just to be confusing. What it does mean, though, is that each aircraft is a slight improvement of the next. If we consider the reconnaissance aircraft over the interwar years, which leads up to the Swordfish, they are Fairey, 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 Blackburn, 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 Fairey. It alternates between these two groups, and each one is a slight development of the previous one. In fact, honestly, when you put the Swordfish down and compare it with its other colleagues from the predecessors, the Swordfish is a slight development of every one of them, and you can make the case, and I certainly have in my past, that the Swordfish is one of the longest, the fruits of one of the longest developments known to mankind. It starts off with the Sopwith Cuckoo in about 1918, and by 1936, when the Swordfish is fully in service, it's finally reached something. But it means that the aircraft developed are incredibly reliable, but they are really not that massive an improvement. No, Sal, the modern US Defense Department is nothing compared to Britain in the 1920s and 30s. They are a model of efficiency in many compared to it. Now, I have to make a confession. Both my sister and my girlfriend seem to be very worried about me giving these presentations without Iron Brew nearby. And I have actually run out of Iron Brew this morning, but thanks to my girlfriend, I do have a on-demand emergency supply. So I will, as I'm under orders, pour myself some. I know, and I should also add, I'm not getting paid by Iron Brew to drink this. Unfortunately, I pay to drink it. Or in this case, my lovely girlfriend supplies it. This is the very, very rare, very special stuff. And she's far too kind. Now, so, leaving the modern US Defense Department to one side, and trust me, they have nothing on the modern Ministry of Defense in Britain, we have to go to what are they looking at? What are they looking at for their aircraft? And what are the Royal Navy looking for? Well, again, it comes back to the Royal Navy are looking at something different to the Japanese and the Americans. And this comes down again to the carriers they've got in service. Now, if I get the sheets I'm going to go to out of the way. These 3. They're not paying me yet, no. If they start offering me free Iron Brew, Cap Commissioner, I will quite happily take the free Iron Brew. Now, these are the fleet carriers. These are what the Royal Navy have to practice their fleet exercises. And they start doing that. And the big exercises, especially in the late 1920s, early 1930s, where they bring the entire Atlantic fleet and the entire Mediterranean fleet together and they go, fight it out, boys. Literally, that's how they position it. The Mediterranean fleet versus the Atlantic fleet and fighting a war. It's immense. At one point, there are more ships involved in some of the Royal Navy exercises in the interwar years than there will be in some of the largest battles in World War II. Okay, there at one point, almost every single aircraft carrier, battleship, cruiser, destroyer the Royal Navy has is duking it out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the Italian fleet is pretty much crying and going, we are not here, this is not our sea, we're keeping as far away from you as possible. Because basically the Royal Navy said, if anyone gets in our way during this exercise, we will ram you out of the way. It works. Is that Malta? Yes, that is Malta. The Royal Navy... Hello, Stefana. The Royal Navy are using these carriers and finding out what they're going on. Now, in the past, I've described what the Americans and Japanese look at is they're looking at the big strike, which is the boom. We're going to hit them, and we're going to hit them hard. What the Royal Navy works out is that this big strike is great. It's lovely, especially if you can do it at night or when the enemy's in harbour. All these things are options. But if you're using it in battle, boom, your big strike. Now you've either got to rearm the aircraft, or you've lost the aircraft, and you've got no fighter protection and nothing, and if your strike hasn't worked, the enemy's big strike can come in and you've got nothing to stop it. That's a problem. Because the Royal Navy very quickly starts to get a different perspective than the Royal Air Force. The reason there are the big fights in the late 1920s, early 1930s, sort of early to mid-1930s, over the RAF's bomber will always get through strategy, is the Royal Navy is the service going, no, it won't. The Royal Navy's investing in air defence weapons because the RAF tells them they'll work, and they are investing in those air defence weapons, but they're also conducting these exercises. And their theory is that their torpedo bombers are a lot more manoeuvrable and actually faster than most of the RAF heavy bombers, despite them looking like this. And please, no one look at the Blackburn Dart. No one. We know it's ugly. You don't need to hurt your eyes. Just, you know, they're okay. They're okay. So, the Royal Navy's looking at it going, but they're not always getting through, and especially if we can disrupt them with fighters. So the Royal Navy starts working out ideas like using destroyers and cruisers as pickets out from the task force to try and give fighters alert. It even uses its spotter aircraft as a form of visual airborne early warning, where they're up there with binoculars looking around. They're also starting to look at if they do want to do a big strike, they need to do it at range the enemy can't get them. So that this is all filtering into the Royal Navy's thought process. First thing that starts to appear is, A, they want range. Well, if you want range, you need navigation. So that means you need a second person in your aircraft. Because pre-GPS, a pilot flying an aircraft, it's quite a heavy job. It's quite a physically taxing and mentally taxing job. Asking them to navigate thousands, hundreds, possibly thousands of miles with no support is impossible. But also, if you have a second person in the plane, as well as doing navigation, they can do observation and they can spot for enemy ships. And the RAF doesn't like doing the training for observation, so the Royal Navy gets to have the observers. And the observers are great for the Royal Navy because they start a whole revolution in the Royal Navy. Suddenly the Royal Navy has this crop of officers regularly going through flight training who are starting to think about naval aviation, to start to think about how to fly. I know pilots might not like it, but the observers become the critical part for the Royal Navy in terms of developing its strategy and its tactics. They did, and Badhone, at the time, did they have radio? They did have radios coming in, but the radios aren't as big and as powerful and as capable as they become later in the war, including the ones in 1939 versus the ones in 1945 are a huge step change in terms of reliability and distance. So it's pretty much unhelpful, and you need the observers. But this is also why the observers are why when people turn around to me and go, well, the Royal Navy had no one to develop the doctrine of naval aviation in the 1920s and 1930s. They did, the observers. In fact, if you look at the people who become some of the senior lights in the Royal Navy Naval Air Service in the World War II, the ones who are developing the battle plans, the ones who are developing the strategies, putting together the tactics, the carrier movements, the organisation, they're all from the observers. In fact, the observers have turned into rather a big elite within the Navy, because whereas naval pilots, naval officers who were flying with the Fleet Air Arm but were part of the RAF, had to deal with the dual rank structure where they might have one rank in the Royal Navy and one rank in the Royal Air Force, and they had all the problems because when they were technically attached to the squadron, they weren't supposed to be doing naval duties and getting their sea time, but if they weren't getting their sea time, they couldn't get promoted. The observers were pure Navy. The observers could do what they like and regularly were doing two-fingered salutes to the Air Ministry and getting on with a naval career. So the observers take a far more regular route and become very critical for the Navy in terms of appreciation of naval aviation. But that also means the Royal Navy starts to go, we have these really good navigators. We're getting this up. Okay, we're going for a long range. Observers were part of Intel. The observers became part of Intel. They were definitely part of the intelligence gathering network, Chaffers and Bray, and they were very useful for that. But mainly they became staff officers in some respects, because the Royal Navy was very bad at producing staff officers, even in days when it did have Greenwich. And the observers were the ones who had the closest experience to staff training, because they had to regularly write reports about what they saw. So then you have, when Admiral Henderson becomes Third Sea Lord, after being Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, his 3 senior officers who he takes with him from his Rear Admiral aircraft carrier days are all observers. They've been observers in the 1920s. So he literally drags them with him and goes, right, we're now going to develop the next generation of carrier air arm. We're going to develop the new generation of the fleet. We're going to develop what we're going to do. But the Royal Navy hasn't just got these. Okay, these are important, and these are what it's developing for its carrier warfare. So it's looking at the big strike for options when a strike is available. But when the strike isn't available, when they're a battle scenario, they've developed, as I told you before, a policy of bang, 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 bang. They want to keep up aircraft going. They want to keep flights of aircraft, keep landing, taking off, to keep pressure on the enemy under a battle scenario. So they've got these two concepts going for their main carriers. But they don't just have main carriers. They also have the babby carriers. The babbies. What are they going to use them for? Well, the Royal Navy, unlike the Japanese and the American Navy on this one, seems to come up with quite a coherent strategy for what to use their small carriers for. The Americans never really have small carriers. They get them in World War II, but they really... I find them a bit weird. The Japanese do have small carriers, but they don't like them. They want the big ones for the big strike. What the Royal Navy goes is, what do we want our small carriers for? Well, it goes back to, if I can find it, if anyone spotted where I put the map of the world I put down overhead a second ago. Ah, there it is. That'll be helpful. Here you go. So, the Royal Navy has to protect this. What are small carriers great for? Providing the numbers to protect this. Carriers, a few strike aircraft are not great for fighting a battle, but if you have a few strike aircraft, 18, 24 on a carrier, they can increase the operations of your cruiser force if they're doing trade protection or if they're doing trade interdiction. These are cruiser carriers, and they are critical for what they're doing. Hello, Liga. Nice to see you, and welcome to join us. Now, basically, the cruiser carriers are what the smaller carriers are for. They're for cruising around, for doing the operations when the Royal Navy doesn't have much of a choice but to protect but to protect trade. And they actually start practicing in the interwar years in exercises, convoy escort. So, for those who think that I have been ignoring HMS Argus, I have been up to this point, because very quickly the Royal Navy, after she's done her testing and has been used to develop naval aviation, Royal Navy comes up with a different idea for her. Escort carrier. And then in World War II, they built some. Pretty much Argus, meet HMS Trumpeter. This was what the Royal Navy practiced her with, and this is what they used. The Royal Navy didn't randomly get this from nowhere. Henderson had plans drawn up as early as 1936. And frankly, they were based on his predecessor's plans, one of his predecessor's plans from the 1920s. The Royal Navy had had escort carriers as a plan since almost the end of World War I. Because they were worried about U-boats, they were worried about surface raiders, and they thought the best force multiplier they could give to convoys was a small carrier with a few aircraft aboard. Usually, these small carriers, as Will's just asked a question, would move in company with another cruiser. They would usually be paired up with a cruiser. For example, in the picture of which I'm fairly sure is HMS Hermes, but some people aren't sure it could be HMS Eagle. You can clearly see in the back there is a little cruiser. And that's a long way off. They always had an escort with them. It would sometimes be destroyers, it would sometimes be cruisers, but they would always have an escort with them. Same with the bigger carriers. They would have an escort with them. In fact, one of the principal jobs for the tribal class destroyers when they were being developed, that was envisaged for them, was the protection of the battle carriers. Yes, there's that phrase come up. Battle carriers. But before I get into battle carriers, I'm going to discuss the carrier which we built first. So, I've told you the Royal Navy are preferring to have an operation where they're going bang, 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 rather than bang for their air defence, for their attack scenario fleet operations. But they still build this. HMS Ark Royal. Why did they build HMS Ark Royal if they are looking at fighting battles? Why build something which is definitely a strike carrier? Because you still needed a strike carrier for certain operations, and because they had a concept going on. And the concept was combined with the armoured battle carriers, the battle carriers. So, the idea was these, like HMS Victorious at Matapan, would be moving with the battle squadrons. They providing the air defence and strike within the battle fleet. This would keep further back. Hopefully not be found by the enemy in terms of a fight. But would therefore be uncool for an admiral to launch a weighted strike if he needed during an operation. Now the thing is, before everyone starts saying but Ark Royal was a one-off, and you can't see it as well here, but you will on my design on the things I was looking at. I was on my WhatsApp. Design X from 1936 is what becomes indomitable and indefatigable, and as you can see from her design, that is a big carrier, and that was the further strike carriers. The Royal Navy plan was to build a force of about 6 battle carriers and 3 strike carriers, along with hopefully 3 to 6 smaller carriers for the cruiser duties. That's roughly, and I would just like to add, this is not something which is necessarily written down somewhere. This is me inferring from a lot of documents and putting them together. This is half of what a historian has to do, is they look at a lot of the documents, because a lot of stuff is never written down, or if it is written down, it doesn't survive in the archives and doesn't survive anywhere. So you have to infer based on what you're looking at, what they're building, what they're talking about. And when they're talking about their carrier groups and their carrier squadrons, it seems to me very naturally that the Royal Navy is looking at ending up with a force where they're looking at having a strike carrier for every pair of battle carriers. And if they're looking at roughly 6 battle carriers, then they must be looking at 3 strike carriers. And obviously that was going to be their 3 squadrons. Now, the Royal Navy was moving very much to a 3-squadron force as it went on to the 1940s in its plans, because it was looking at a global war, potentially. And it made sense to have a carrier squadron in the Atlantic, a carrier squadron in the Mediterranean, and potentially a carrier squadron in the Far East. Now, it could have been going to be a cruiser carrier, and they could have kept one of the other carrier squadrons back, but this is all the potentials, because I think myself, it could well have ended up with a cruiser squadron, a carrier squadron plus HMS Unicorn sitting in the Far East as a sort of mobile force to base around their forces out there. But we'll never know. So the Royal Navy has a strike carrier. It has the big strike in battle. It also has, courtesy of the experience of Crookshaven, the plans for Wilhelmshaven, and the experience, the Royal Navy legacy, the absolute trauma of the German fleet not coming to fight. Do you realise, actually, the German fleet not coming out to fight in World War I probably did more psychological damage to the entire Royal Navy than losing any battle ever has. They are prepared to lose battles. The enemy not coming out and fighting them, that is something which did lifelong trauma. So that turns into a harbour attack committee and a harbour defence committee in Parliament. It turns into all sorts of things. And when Henderson wants to build his strike carrier and get it through, all he has to do is go, but remember the German fleet? And the money comes. This ship gets built incredibly quickly. It gets procured incredibly quickly. And all he's had to do was literally go, remember the Germans? It causes psychological trauma. He manages to get this ship built really quickly, and it's in service. And it is the strike force designed to, if necessary, find an enemy fleet in their harbour and take them out. The really strange thing is that when it happens, they actually use one of these, one of his battle carriers. Now, there are various options for it, for why that happens, why Taranto goes that. But pretty much it happens, it means that he gets, one of his carriers does get involved in the strike and does carry out Taranto. But it does mean the strike's not quite as devastating as it could have been. But that's because, as the sole strike carrier then in service with the Royal Navy, the Germans and the Italians were obsessed with where this was being. Because actually this one doing something else in the Mediterranean provided plenty of cover for this one to get close. A ruse which Henderson would definitely have been proud of. Jonas, King of Sparta. Why? As long as the Hosh fleet didn't fight, they remained stuck. Doesn't sound too bad. It does sound bad when you're the Royal Navy. Remember, the Royal Navy used to being the shield, the spear, everything of empire, protecting Britain, protecting the global empire. They were built up to fight that battle. That battle was what they'd spent 20 years preparing for. And it didn't happen. For the Royal Navy, that was a massive psychological loss. And actually, you can say that the World War II is this sort of cathartic relief. They get the Battle of North Cape. They get the Battle of Matapan, Spartivento, Taranto. They get all these battles. And they get to actually do the fighting which they've been training and preparing for so many years. It's a really big relief. A single German battleship, Charles Bray, because a single German battleship tied down 3 of ours. Pretty much, yes. You still go in and try and take them out. Tis Francis' fault. Yes, the RN could be said to have got blue something. You're very correct, but I will not repeat that because children might watch this video later. So the Royal Navy are looking at all these things. They are building up a naval aviation force based around these options. The option, though, that's really interesting is when you start to look at this aircraft development, and hopefully this has gone live now, or will do shortly. Now, when you look at this, what you notice very quickly is that the Swordfish, when it comes in, is quite long-ranged. For a single-engine aircraft, it's very long-ranged. And this is what the Royal Navy's looking for. But actually, strangely enough, on paper, it's actually not as good as the Blackburn Shark. So how come the Swordfish wins against, the Fairey Swordfish wins against the Blackburn Shark? And Blackburn, by the way, have produced 50% of the Royal Navy's spotter aircraft. They have produced, up until the Swordfish, 100% of the Royal Navy's torpedo aircraft. Why does the Swordfish win? It's reliable as anything. Literally. I know, I did that in a funny voice. How was the Italian Navy countering the British in the Mediterranean? What was their strategy? The Italian Navy, Stefano's strategy for the British in the Mediterranean was they thought they were going to fight a massive battle and win with a smaller part. They thought, again, rather like the German High Seas Fleet, they could get a small enough part of the Royal Navy separated off that they could overwhelm it and destroy it. This almost happened at Spartavento. That was pretty much their major opportunity for that, and they didn't. They didn't manage to succeed. There was a plan to attack a port in Sweden using the Swordfish, Force A1. I don't think it ever got carried out, although the Finnish certainly considered doing a lot of things with their various darts. So, why does the Swordfish, why is it so reliable versus the Blackburn options? Well, the Swordfish uses a Bristol Pegasus, which is a very reliable air-cooled radial engine. Incredibly reliable. This means it actually takes less maintenance than the Blackburn's one, and it has a longer range. It also was very, very light in terms of its power to weight wing lift ratio, and could carry a lot of supplies. But the biggest advantage of the Swordfish over the Blackburn was its ability to be fitted with extra fuel tanks. The Swordfish was, of course, designed for a 3-person crew where the middle seat could be turned into an extra fuel tank to give you extra range. It could also carry external fuel. These were all really good advantages. However, this does leave me to one point. The Royal Navy knew about this, in what I'm about to say, in the in about 1938, 1939. And there was actually an informal discussion with the Observer Corps, and the Observer Corps as a whole said, we do our duty. The Swordfish, when it has the centre fuel tank fitted internally into the cockpit, has a tendency to leak, and the fuel tends to find an equilibrium with the back cockpit where the observer will be sitting. Which meant at Taranto, the Royal Navy, well, the observers who were flying in the Swordfish were mostly waist deep in aviation fuel. So anyone who wants to think about how brave you have to be to fly into a storm of tracer fire with an 1,800-pound high explosive torpedo underneath you and still calmly provide directions, I just think they must have been colossally brave. And I also think, honestly, that's probably the same caliber that special forces are made of, because, yeah, takes a lot of bravery. Or insane. We'll go with brave. Brave sounds better. There is a Norman Freeman behind me. This one. And this one. There's lots of them, actually. There's even more over there. Norman Freeman's books are very, very good and very useful. I have arguments with him occasionally, but he's also one of the best naval historians of our age, and I have worked with him. He's amazing. That is a suborbital design when it comes to the Swordfish fuel. Yes, it could be said to, but it could give them a very, very long range. And that was the whole point. The Royal Navy were looking at very long range. Matthew Malachy, did the Royal Navy ever look at American Navy aircraft before 1949 for testing evaluation to see if they had features that they would like to have? Yes, in fact, aircraft went backwards and forwards. If you look at pretty much most of the torpedo bombers, the Royal Navy and the American Navy buy each other's torpedo aircraft on regular occasions. And that is how they develop, how the Royal Navy, and they look at each other's types, but they have a different policy going forward on what they're doing. And I remember the Americans have the ability to sit back and watch for 3 years of war developing their aircraft. That really does help. The Swordfish, as I point out, is specified in 1930, entered service in 1935. So it had already been in service for 4 years by the time World War II happened. If you consider the Blackburn Baffin entered service in 1934 and was retired in 1936. Service entry life was not that long for aircraft normally in sort of when they were superseded. Hugh Davey, Norman Freeman's book on British carrier aviation shows Ark Royal as an early development of later armoured carriers rather than a separate type. We'll be interested to hear your evidence. Right, so yes and no. Okay. The Ark Royal is developed from the same structure and idea of the armoured carriers, but she's developed for strike, they're developed for battle. And I put this down to the way they put the armour hanger balance and how they then structure it when they're looking at indomitable and indefatigable. It works out, and my PhD thesis is full of this stuff, that the carriers are basically being designed for two sides of the same fleet action. The Royal Navy, the strike carrier, the Ark Royal, is for dealing with the fleets in harbour. It's for providing the Admiral that big punch when they need it, especially for night actions and night operations. But they want to keep her further back. The battle carriers they see as being far closer. For example, HMS Victorious, sailing with the battleships is not unusual. That is what she was supposed to be. She was supposed to be up as close to the battleships, as close to the battle as possible, so she could be rearming and repairing aircraft constantly to provide air cover. Because again, the Royal Navy's idea was that if you had these carriers as far forward as possible, hence they needed to have armour and protection, because they were likely going to be found and hit, that meant that you would have air defence on call. You would have the fighters up there with the force instead of keeping the carriers back safe. So you can say the Royal Navy's idea is slightly weird in that the Royal Navy's idea is instead of using the carriers to separate off from the enemy, they're thinking about using the carriers to help them close down on the enemy. Now, this works when you start thinking that the Royal Navy's thinking about night actions. Because again, with night actions, they're thinking about coming across the fleet. They're also worried about enemy destroyers managing to get into the force and all these things. Which is why the Royal Navy aircraft carriers have so many guns on them. Because the Royal Navy is basically going, if a destroyer gets close at night, you need to be able to destroy them. And that is what a carrier wants. So the evidence is that the Royal Navy is looking for a way out of its conundrum. And its conundrum is it's got to be a 7-ocean navy. There is no ocean in the world it cannot be a major force in. It cannot be a major presence in. And in any war, any global war scenario, it could quite easily end up fighting major powers in the Far East and in Europe. And therefore it needs to develop a fleet which can do this. And needs to start thinking about how it's going to offset them. So it's thinking about night strategy. It's thinking about its carrier survival. It's thinking about all these things. Yes, Formidable did get stuck in at Matapan and did leave very, very begrudgingly. Very, very begrudgingly. In fact, the whole of the armoured carriers, as I like to call them, armoured hangar carriers, get stuck into fights whenever they get a chance. The RN's underwhelming carrier fighters was due to focus on night fighting, or am I mistaken? Actually, no. The RN's underwhelming carrier fighters are a product of two things. One, if you're going to have fighters, they might as well do the reconnaissance role as well. So you need a second person in as observers. Secondly, you have the fact that, as I explained at the beginning, the procurement process, the ability to procure aircraft is very long-winded in terms of the engineering getting back to the Royal Navy about what's possible. And finally, the biggest problem you have for the Royal Navy is until you get radar in wide use, fighters are depending upon visual observation to be launched from a carrier to be able to intercept an enemy air attack. So you're basically depending on a picket, a destroyer or a cruiser, which is out from the task force, spotting the enemy, calling up, and the fighters being directed, or the fighters being airborne and being directed. They did prefer to try and keep some airborne to direct them, but still that wasn't really going to be a lot of aircraft. It's only once you get radar that fighters start to work as interceptors. And even then, the Royal Navy is hamstrung by various scenarios going to go with how they're going to develop their fighters and how they're going to build them. Do the carriers perform well in ship-to-ship action, or is it an extension of classic warfare branch, Nelsonitis? Thank you, Tom, for that question. Okay. The carriers weren't designed to take on battleships. Hence, what happens to Glorious. And shouldn't have happened to Glorious. But they were also an issue that they were quite good when it turned out to be against destroyers and against ships, carriers out of fighting. And so did the air group. This didn't always mean that the carrier commanders kept out of fighting. And at various cases, it's been suggested that in certain of the more distant amphibious operations, Royal Navy carriers might have lended their firepower to the bombardment, but they certainly weren't supposed to. Okay? And those are rumours. Force A1, weren't they also limited by the lack of powerful enough engines? Yes, I've said this before, and they definitely had it as a problem. One of the most interesting things that happens is when Henderson starts a campaign in 1933, when he becomes Third Sea Lord, to get back control of the Fleet Air Arm for the Navy. So they have the connection with the companies, they have the connection with the engineers. And he gets it in 1939, and literally before he dies, he manages some of his last orders are ordering the 2,000 horsepower engines, the Rolls-Royce Griffin, the Napier Sabre, which are going to be critical for the second half of the Second World War, and which the RAF hasn't ordered because they don't need them. If they need more power, they just stick another pair of engines on a bomber, and it goes from 2 engines to 4 Merlins, and it's brilliant. It's called a Lancaster. You've got enough power then. Well, hey, if you're operating single-engine aircraft, that single engine is really critical. But the Royal Navy haven't really been told how much power was capable. They were having a lot of interesting debates about this. And one of the most interesting arguments that I've ever heard, and when I say heard, I've read, is when the Royal Navy are looking at power for their motor torpedo boats. And Rolls-Royce are offering the Merlin engine. And they go, you do realise this is also an aircraft engine? And the Navy go, And literally Henderson goes, I told you. It's quite funny. And of course, they do get a Merlin powered aircraft, but it's the Fairey Flycatcher. Salut. You're all going back to that first picture now. The first picture as to whether it was Eagle or Hermes. Yeah, my notes could be wrong. To be honest, I hope they're not. I'll have to go check on that one. But I will look up, and if I am wrong, I will post a proper picture of Hermes. But no. Down my notes is a Flycatcher and Hermes. Ah, well. So, now, the whole point with the naval aviation, with the aircraft carriers, is there probably also Henderson ordering engine? I would like to read more about that. No, because my book hasn't been published yet. No, there are some sources. I have got their very old books though. Where is it? I've got a book about the development of aero engines by Roy Granston, which I cannot see for the life of me. But I was using it to teach students earlier a few weeks ago, so I could have put it down somewhere. First rule of Wafu Club is never mention the Fulmar. The Fulmar is okay. It survives. It does have a ram bow. But Henderson ordering the engines is one of those things which is rather an interesting piece of history. I have to say, when I first found it out, I was very, very shocked. And it's one of the first pieces of fact. I started my PhD thesis knowing about Henderson, but thinking he was just involved in the carriers. Because that's what I'd studied. But then I found out he was very much involved in the aviation side as well when it came back to the Royal Navy, and very much pushing for certain things. And you find that he managed to do it all before the 5th Sea Lord gets involved. And the 5th Sea Lord is, of course, the person set up to run the Fleet Air Arm. But before he managed to be set up and in place, all the procurement has to go through the 3rd Sea Lord. So there's often a debate as to whether it's the 5th Sea Lord or the 3rd Sea Lord who orders these things. Well, it's the 3rd Sea Lord, because the orders go through before the 5th Sea Lord's allowed to sign checks. And also before they even have a procurement department or anything. Did the RN miss a trick by focusing on single engines? I mean, didn't a brand of Mosquito get used in later stages? Eventually, they managed to develop things to the point to which they can use multi-engine aircraft from carriers, but it's not really till post-Second World War. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of development that goes into them, and by that point, jets are far more likely to come through. Basically, multi-engine aircraft would have been useful and would have been nice, but it's building a multi-engine aircraft which could work on the carriers the Royal Navy had available in the 1920s and 30s and most of the Second World War. Single-engined aircraft are pretty much good for it. Winkle Brown loved it. Yes, he did. Winkle Brown did love the Fulmar. He loved a lot of things. It says Francis Fault and Banham. Yes. Henderson is one of those officers who, as frankly, he doesn't get enough said about him because he dies. And because he dies, other people forget him. Or rather, they don't forget him. If he's discussed too much, they don't get as much credit. So he gets put down quietly. But he is really one of those officers who's very involved in this period. And there's also the fact he's unusual in the length of time he spends as 3rd Sea Lord. And one of the things I do love about it is he basically goes to the 1st Sea Lord time. I will not stay as 3rd Sea Lord any longer unless I am guaranteed when I finish being 3rd Sea Lord, I'm going to get a fleet command, because I don't want my career to stop off and end in the Admiralty. And the 1st Sea Lord basically goes, name the fleet you want. You'll have it when you finish your time. And the whole plan was that in 1939, 1940, he was supposed to go off and command a fleet. He didn't manage to. I call him the steel theorist because he doesn't write stuff down, he builds it. Now, when it comes to naval aviation, he does have a clear plan, and the whole Royal Navy as a whole has a clear plan. The Royal Navy is thinking about naval aviation very, very focused in the 1930s. After World War II, you have a problem in that a lot of the history is written with an American carrier focus because the Americans have done all these big carrier battles and are now obsessed with carriers. They are really, really obsessed with them. And they're really great, and they're really great. And the American way of carriers is brilliant. I would point out, and this is something I'm going to be covering a lot on Sunday, the Japanese Navy and the American Navy end World War II copying Royal Navy carrier design. Shamelessly, purely, completely. Because Royal Navy carrier design allows them to take heavier aircraft easier and to operate their carriers more safely. And that is, of course, you make the flight deck the strength deck. That is the entire reason you're able to put up armor and everything there. That is the big change. That change actually happens with Ark Royal, but is then, of course, developed further with the Illustrious class and then the Indomitable class and all the other ones which come subsequently. The flight deck as the strength deck. It's critical. And that is all made possible by the work of Stanley Goodall, who is, of course, Henderson's pet naval architect and the director of naval construction. It's a partnership between the two. And it works really well because the Royal Navy has an admiral who's very much an activist admiral who's able to manage the politics as well as organise, understand the technology and push for it, knows what he wants. But also they have a naval architect who's very much able to do the development of things as well. Gudrun gets all the credit for German tank doctrines because he survived the war. Yes, it is. It's always the survivors who claim the credit. Hugh Davey, Marder old friends, new enemies, stressed Japan as the main enemy, especially during Chatfield's tenure as First Sea Lord and his support of Henderson. Yes, Japan was a good enemy to stress, but that doesn't mean they were building just for Japan. If they talked about Germany, then there was a lot of reaction against it, a lot of horror, a lot of desire not to. Remember, the horror of the First World War was magnified even more any time you talked about fighting a war against Germany again, because no one could envision that. But Japan was just far enough away, just different enough that saying their war with them was a possibility. It was more politically acceptable. So you could talk about war with Japan and it would be accepted. The other advantage was if you could build a fleet to go all the way around the world and fight against the Japanese, that same fleet could fight in the Mediterranean against the Italians and could fight against the Germans in the North Atlantic. Because if a fleet could operate on the other side of the world from its industrial base, it could operate close to its industrial base. Didn't the US copy the UK? Didn't the UK copy the US for the Malta designs? No. Actually, the Malta designs are a sort of development of, once you get out of the problem of having to conform within treaty limits, having your strike and your battle carriers as separate things is no longer necessary. It's a reaction in many ways to treaty limits, i.e. you have to do these two roles and you have to fill them within a certain tonnage. So you can only put, need more armour on the battle carrier, which is going to be next to the battle fleet, and you can put more aircraft in the strike carrier, which is going to be in the strike doing the strike job. If you don't have those limitations, if you can build what you want, you go, right then, I'm building one carrier that can do both. And that carrier is going to have enough armour it can be closer to the battle, though it won't be as close to the battle fleet as we've been envisaging, because we now know we want to keep further back. We don't want to let the aircraft carriers that close, because they're too precious to let them that close. And it can carry enough aircraft to be a strike carrier. And actually you start to see this in the Indomitable and Implacable designs and those ones coming through, but you can also see how they developed. Initial Malta designs were armoured. In fact, initial Malta designs for 41 were very armoured, and they continued to be. What is often not listed is the fact that it's not just the armour that's fitted, but it's the thickness of steel used for bulkheads. Now, that is a big giveaway. With the Malta class, the thickness of steel for bulkheads is almost double that proposed for the Ark Royal. Cap, come around. Do you think that RN's bigger carrier battles get sidelined in history because many were in the Med against land-based aircraft, pedestal at all, and thus less glamorous than the Midway fleet battle? Yes, they do. They get sidelined completely because of that. It's far less glamorous because you don't ever get to shout out that sign, splash one flat top. You know, that is the cool thing. That is what makes Midway as the movie works. We just watch it for splash at a flat top. Literally the whole thing is they get to sink other enemy carriers. The Royal Navy has a problem. By the time it gets out into the Far East in sufficient numbers and manages to really push into the Pacific, most of the Japanese carriers aren't there anymore for them to go and fight. What would have been interesting but ultimately very horrific is what would have happened off the coast of Japan if there hadn't been nuclear bombs and there had to be an invasion of Japan. What Royal Navy carrier doctrine would have gotten involved, what the carriers would have done, would have been very, very different, because the Americans still have a lot of carriers which have wooden flight decks, and the strength deck is the hangar level. So it's level down. Now, that means they could be put out of action, and they could have been severely damaged. They have never made a decent Taranto movie. They've never, ever made a decent Taranto movie. It's terrible. It's just... The Dam Busters get all the decent British flying movies, not Taranto. The Royal Navy are building these for these carrier fights and taking part in these carrier fights, but if they got into the war against Japan and the invasion of Japan, you would probably have been looking at a very different scenario in that, in terms of the American forces by D+3 would have probably been smashed to pieces. Literally, the sheer amount of kamikazes and other scenarios putting forward. The Americans would have still probably had some carriers operational, but how many of those carriers they'd be able to sustain operationally is a different matter, because the Japanese focus would have shifted, and they had plans which seem to have shifted from going after the enemy carriers to going after their supply train. And if you can take out the carriers, you can take out the supply train, they're going to be stuck down. Whereas the Royal Navy carriers and, of course, HMS Unicorn and other ships of the supply train were all armoured. So the Royal Navies would have kept going, which would have helped them and kept them keeping going. But it would have been a bloodbath for everyone involved. Unexpected item in bagging area. I'm sorry, so much for notifications. I do try tweets going on constantly. And that is the other thing we need to think about in terms of our Royal Navy's fleet aviation, its development, is HMS Unicorn. I know, I talked about her in the title and I haven't got onto her now. This is the big difference the Royal Navy has to any other navy, in that not only are its aircraft focused on their survivability, on their continued operation, their reliability, their ease of maintenance, the Royal Navy is actually building a forward maintenance aviation support carrier. Now, yes, it becomes the model for the light fleet carrier and all these things, but this is part of the difference between the Royal Navy's approach and, to an extent, the Japanese and American approach. Unexpected item bagging area. Yes, I know. YouTube is fun sometimes. But fingers crossed for next time. With HMS Unicorn, the fleet is able to move that much further. The Royal Navy is able to push itself that much further. Force A1, what sort of workshop spaces did Unicorn have? Unicorn could strip down any aircraft type in its entirety and rebuild it. And they could have, depending on your conversation, they can have up to 30 aircraft in various forms of refit aboard her at any one time. Now, some people say it's smaller, some people say it's bigger, and it depends on how many chunks they've broken up the aircraft into. But they really do a lot of intensive work, and they can recondition engines. They can, if you can think of anything you would like aboard a floating maintenance shop for your aircraft carriers, for your aircraft, Unicorn had it. It even has its own specialist lighter, which it can drop down, a self-powered barge, which can drop down off the stern, which can go and collect aircraft from carriers where they're damaged. So it can send its little boat out, collect the damaged aircraft, bring them back to Unicorn, winch them up, take them in, repair them, and then fly them back to the carrier. And they do this. The Royal Navy scares the American Navy with how often they find aircraft which they presume would have been written off are back working within a few days or even a week. And the American Navy is going, well, why don't you just get another one? We've got more aircraft coming. And the Royal Navy goes, yes, but we'd like them for other pilots. We need as many aircraft as we can so we can keep as many pilots as we can flying. Yes, the lighter is very cool. Interwar year. This is Francis' fault. How would the RN have dealt with the Japanese fleet in the interwar year? As much as the RN focused on night attacks and Swordfish was a surprisingly good plane, but those Japanese mass strikes. So, the RN's plan, and I got into this into the global war, preparing for a global war video, which I did last week. The RN's plan does not entirely rest on night flying. They do want to fight at night. They do want to take out the Japanese at night, but they want to fight them in the day. So their plan is to find them, then fly in and take them out. Now, here's the thing: the Naval Aviation's plan is to focus on the aircraft carriers. Take out them, you take out the eyes of the Japanese fleet is the idea. Then the battleships can close in and in day or night can take out the rest at their own leisure. So the Royal Navy's plan is very much based on we take out as much as we can and then we go in and kill the rest. Now remember, their plan for stopping the Japanese fleet from gathering together was to use their cruisers as an economic warfare to force them to move around and to force them to break up to chase the cruisers. This is another Royal Navy strategy. So the Royal Navy has a few different layers to their strategy for fighting them. Okay, some questions are skipping past me. I'm going to see if I can scroll to them. Sal. Noffy, in his examination of the US fleet problems, discussed the use of cruiser and battleship float planes in tactical roles in their fleet problems. Did the RN foresee such use? Yes, the RN did want to use these aircraft in their operations, especially in their reconnaissance roles. But they, in practice, in World War II, they found carrier aircraft far more easy to use and far easier to maintain and repair and keep going. So that's why they get phased out. But certainly in peacetime and beginning of World War II, they're critical for their economic warfare roles. Cat Commiserate. How much did plans for ships like Unicorn make up for the difference in spare aircraft carriage between US and Japanese CVs and RN ones? After their RN ships carried fewer spares. The RN ships did carry fewer spares, but the RN aircraft were as a whole far more easy to repair and reliable than their American and Japanese counterparts. But there again, Unicorn makes up for a big difference, and it's a difference in approach to aircraft. The Japanese and the US aircraft are far more likely to chuck an aircraft over the side and bring down a new one and order a new one, whereas the Royal Navy is more likely to spend hours and hours repairing it. It's different focuses on it, but also it's, again, remember, Royal Navy's building to fight the other side of the world from its industrial base, or it's already operating inside a world war scenario when it's going into it, so where everything matters. Whereas the US and Japanese are both sitting on either side of their oceans, and they have their industrial bases closer to hand. Was the light fleet carrier design a continuation of the Unicorn? Yes, unreservedly, yes. In fact, Henderson is quite shameless when he's designing Unicorn, in that he's calling it HMS Unicorn and he's trying to tell people it's not an aircraft carrier, and then when they build the light fleet carrier, they basically copy and paste. So it is a shameless distraction. And the fact he even calls it HMS Unicorn just shows he's getting egotistical at this point and having a lot of fun with it. Tom Cope, does that make it an aircraft carrier? I guess, Tom, it does. Travis and Bray, read cruiser histories, and it's remarkable how often their aircraft were unserviceable. Yes, they were. Well, the example I would give is I have a picture, because I was planning on getting to this, and today's is going to be longer because, frankly, it's one of those topics I love. HMS Enterprise. Yes, HMS Enterprise. Right. It's predecessor and namesake of one of our current Royal Navy vessels. They're one of the most famous on Twitter. And this is a Hawker Osprey. Just before anyone thinks the Royal Navy just gets Fairey and Blackburns, they also got Hawker aircraft. That was a good one as well. Now, those were fighters. They carried fighters, reconnaissance fighters, is how the Royal Navy pitched them. Yes, we're fitting our cruisers with reconnaissance aircraft. They're a reconnaissance fighter. So they got 2 people in them, but they're still maneuverable as a fighter. It works. It's basically the RN's plan on how to provide air defense for their fleet, how to provide... Remember, you've got the carrier forward of the battle force, but you've got to have extra fighters as well, and you've got to launch aircraft as many as possible. The Royal Navy could do this. They could have these aircraft, but they found them in practice quite problematic to maintain, because if you consider how exposed this is, you get in a firefight, that is going to get shot to hell. And that is what happens. You know, the example was an article I was reading, a quote I read the other day from Stanley Goodall, and I read it on one of the videos. when designing a ship, when designing anything, you need to, when you're putting in aircraft, you need to protect them not only from gunfire from the enemy, but your own gunfire, because they can be damaged by both. They're very, very fragile, so they have to be protected. And this causes problems with ship design, which is another reason why they end up being phased out, and why these days, when you have a helicopter fitted, they're on the stern and the guns are all on the front, because we're keeping the guns as far away from the aircraft as possible. Yeah, it is. Draken for now. Those 3 men looking at the aircraft is begging for an incredulous caption. Please, anyone who wants to put a caption on this, as I said, it is going to be tweeted out on my at AC_naval history. Please add on a caption. Let's enjoy that one. Aircraft carriers can maintain Unicorn could fix, and USN carriers just chucked damaged aircraft overboard and had poor reliability too. Yes, Chaffers and Bray, that's pretty much it. That was the Royal Navy's policy. Hugh Davies, sustaining the main fleet at sea for a sustained period from its main base, Singapore, with Unicorn shuttling back and forward between them for sustained operations. As I've said before, Singapore, basically consider it like your a theatre depot, your structured base that you can build from. The Royal Navy is going to be operating from Weihai Wei, which was set up and was going to have an airfield and those sort of things. So actually, don't think about Unicorn operating between Singapore and Weihai Wei. Think about her more likely operating from Weihai Wei to wherever the fleet is operating off the coast of Japan, going backwards and forwards. Tis Francis fault. How capable was the UK able to build new carriers? Seeing as build strategy is so important in war, I assume they could outbuild anyone other than the US, or were they complex and expensive? Okay. Yeah, pretty much the Royal Navy could outbuild anyone other than the US. But again, the aircraft carriers they were building were slightly more complicated and were more expensive than their US counterparts. The reason they were more complex and more expensive was because the Royal Navy was trying to make them more survivable. So they had the strength decks as the flight deck. They had armor. They had all sorts of things inside them. Fire curtains, fire defense mechanisms. The Royal Navy basically designed their ships to take a lot of damage. One of the interesting things is experience in First World War has taught them the danger of the the fuel cables for aviation fuel running around the ship and how those can go on fire. Experience with Ben Mashiri, actually. And so the Royal Navy is obsessive. And up until probably the Battle of Coral Sea, more than the Battle of Midway, the USN is not quite sure why the Royal Navy is so obsessive about this subject. After the Battle of Coral Sea, and I'm never quite sure about this because it's something which was told to me by naval architects, and I haven't yet found the data which backs it up. So if anyone does know where the data is that backs up, I'd really love to know. The American systems changed to very similar to the British systems in terms of their fuel management, in terms of some of their key valves and their key points. And a lot of naval architects suspect that the British basically just handed them designs and told them to go fix your aircraft carriers. We're not quite sure. It might be the Americans looked at their battle damage and came up with very similar solutions, which is a very good possibility. But I haven't been able to find the archival data, and I know Norman Freeman and that lot don't discuss it. So, have I shown you all the pictures? I have shown you all the pictures. Any questions? If you have any questions, any more questions? I like questions. What I will say, well, you're possibly thinking of questions, hopefully. Please, can you subscribe? Please, can you like and all that sort of thing? Because, as I said, I'm in a competition with my aunt for bragging rights. That is important. If I can get to 1,000, then I get bragging rights. Personally, I'd love to get to 1,000 by April, but end of April. But that's my ego talking. I'm doubtful of that one. What I will say is, again, thank you to Brad Pittler for his high points. I know I brought this up at the beginning, but thank you for that. And thank you again to those people who've become patrons. That's very, very kind of you. As I've said before, that's going to go towards funding future research trips and my travels and wanders when I go and do research in archives, because that stuff is always really cool and hopefully will be presented on here and in other write-ups. And frankly, though, it does cost a lot. So thank you very much. Thank you for those. It's very generous of you. Travis and Bray, what of seaplane tenders? The Royal Navy was sort of less keen on seaplanes than other navies were. Principally because their idea was they had a lot of ocean to protect, and the idea of setting up a seaplane tender in a port and then using it to launch seaplanes was a lovely thing for protecting one area, but it wasn't good for anything else. Michael Rose, I've seen that the Hawkins class cruisers were considered for conversion to a carrier. Any thoughts on this? They considered them incredibly small. Incredibly small. It was an idea, but no. Bandholm, when did the idea of the commando carriers come? The commandos carriers come post Second World War. And really they come once you've got the development of helicopters. And that's when they start to think about it. All right, Giulio Pagoni mentions about yesterday's discussion on the RN attack on Tobruk in July 1940. The RN like to do a lot of attacks. Tobruk in 1940 is, of course, where a destroyer gets struck, and in many ways, it's kind of like a Taranto scene. The Royal Navy will always hit any harbour they can. It's a big part of the strike carrier philosophy, which, of course, the Royal Navy has built into its own designs. But it's also a big part of how the Royal Navy is approaching war. Any chance they can take out enemy equipment, they will do so. And also, we're discussing that far more on Sunday, when we're looking at the period which is going to be literally the beginning. Basically, I've got to do another one which is going to be 1939 to 1944, roughly. Sort of how does the carrier fleet of 1944 come back, and what's the Royal Navy looking at doing? Where did RAF Coastal Command fit in with this? 401, that's always a good question. The Royal Navy always wants to work with Coastal Command, although they're not quite trusting of them. And the Air Force is never that funding of Coastal Command. Coastal Command is basically, if you could say one thing, Bomber Command is the first and foremost service in the RAF in the 1930s. Then comes Fighter Command. And then comes Coastal Command. And that's the order of priority. And Transport Command is somewhere down there. Oh, they're poor people. And things change in war when there's more funding, when there's more duties, when they have to do things. But it's something which has to be grown on. The Royal Navy likes to try and work with them, but they never really manage to get much involved in them. And actually, one of the interesting things is the exercises which the Royal Navy does in the North Sea against surface raiders in the 1930s. They use carrier aircraft to simulate Coastal Command aircraft, because there's not enough Coastal Command aircraft actually available, actually working and serviceable to take part in the exercises. April 41, wasn't it? Jefferson Bray. I'm not sure what that's. I think that's probably a reply to someone else's question further up the conversation. But there were a lot of strikes on Tobruk and a lot of strikes on various places by the Royal Navy. Basically, any chance the Royal Navy gets, they like to do it. Please answer. Verta Sumi, if this fits, please answer. But between the 1942 design light carriers and the Independence class, which was the more capable class? If you're American and you want your big strike, big hit, you want your Independence class. If you're Royal Navy and you want your constant hitting, you want the 1942 light fleet carriers. And that is the difference. It's the difference in terms of operations. If you want to do a big strike, big hit, big launch, you want your Independence class. If you want to keep your constant movement of aircraft, your constant ability to fight, and your constant flow of aircraft going fighting, then it's the 1942 light fleet carriers. Basically, it depends on what you want from your aircraft carriers as to which is the better. I would go for the Royal Navy's ones, the light fleet carriers. But if I was American, I'd be very happy with the Independence class, because they will fit exactly what I want to do with them and how I think about them. Wonder if the US Navy might come with a modern-day HMS Unicorn as part of future Pacific Ocean considerations. America class. Actually, I'd say USS America, the first one, I'd say is pretty much a light fleet carrier. They deleted the well deck and they made her into a light aircraft carrier. Yes, I know she's not Cadabar, so she can't support the conventional operations, but she is a light carrier. Cat Commiserate, do you think Coral Sea and Midway are a good demonstration of the problems where both sides chase after the Alpha Strike and good chance both launch and bomb the hell out of each other, resulting in MAD? Yes, it's exactly the scenario. Both are chasing after the Alpha Strike, so neither has anything to defend them. And that's kind of the interesting scenario. How would a Royal Navy fleet have dealt with the Alpha Strike? It would have probably had fighters back to disrupt it, and especially post-radar, it would have been able to disrupt it quite heavily. But there again, it wouldn't have the weight of aircraft going in. But if it had taken managed to catch the enemy at night, then it wouldn't matter if the weight of aircraft were going in, because the enemy would not be able to sleep the entire night. So it depends on your policies. This one's fault. Italians, what was their position on aircraft carriers? They were good at plane development, sort of, and had interesting ships, or did they depend on the Italian geographic location? It starts off as depending upon the Italian geographic location and a dispute between their air force and their navy over who's going to control the aircraft and all these things. As the war goes on, they basically decide they need an aircraft carrier, but it's a bit too late, and by the time the Italians switch sides, the aircraft carriers never entered service. It's just, Dragon Fennel. The Swordfish could do bombing and torpedo strikes, so could the Barracuda. Was this dual role a specifically requested feature to allow the greater strike in either format given smaller groups? Yes, it was. It was a critical. In fact, the Swordfish was actually a fairly decent, in some respects, dive bomber, but you really didn't want to try and put it through it, because apparently the wings, the wires screamed worse than any siren ever fitted to a Ju-87. Have you found a photograph of Henderson yet, Hugh Davies? Yes, I have. I found a few of them a couple of them now. One was given to me by the family, and another one I found in a book by the Naval Institution of Naval Architects. We'll see. We'll see. How much better place would the UK have been if Coastal Command had been part of the RN? If the Royal Navy had controlled the Fleet Air Arm from 1939, from 1918, and Coastal Command, there would have been a difference. Whether it would have been better or worse, we're not quite sure. It depends on money. The Royal Navy would have had to have the money, and would have had to have got the money and argue for the money. But the Royal Navy would have also were quite a technically motivated service, so you could probably see them investing quite a lot in this new technical arm. So things could have happened, but it's something which is open for debate. It's one of those things where you can say it would have been great, and in other scenarios you can say it would have been better, terrible. We hope it would be better, but it couldn't have been much worse. The League of 30 was thinking more about HMS Unicorn's ability to repair and refurbish, though, specifically. Goes along with things such as a renewed interest in vertical launch system replenishment in my mind. Ah, that's good. So 50, 54, 55 were first discussions around RM off carriers. US Thetis Bay was converted to CVHA-1 in 1955. Yep. So it's about 1950s that the Royal Navy do start to think about these things. And you have to remember that it's after experiencing the Korean War, and they're looking at the Suez Crisis. And when the Suez Crisis happens, of course, the Royal Marines do a vertical lift and a vertical insertion, which is a whole other ball game. It is France fault. It's as I thought, and the fight between Air Force and Navy Air Wings are truly as old as flight. Yes, they are. In fact, they started off as fights between Army Air Wings and Air Force Air Wings. Army Air Wings and Navy Air Wings. It was the Royal Flying Corps. And actually, I will post the pictures of Henderson on Twitter. The one I can. One I can't because I haven't got the family's permission, but one I can do. As it's for basically the Royal Navy and the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps are constantly getting into fights during World War One, and mainly the Royal Flying Corps are complaining because they think the RNAS is getting preferential treatment and more funding and all these things. And actually, what they don't realise is simply enough, the Royal Navy have just put in a very efficient logistics system to support them, and a very technically minded engineering logistics system. And the engineers running it are all Royal Navy engineers, not people who are just officers at engineering some sort of artificery. It causes huge debates. And eventually it gets decided to, one of the reasons why the RAF is formed is to stop these fighting, because it's considered bad for the war effort, because it's just one side complaining about the other side the whole time and the other side then laughing back. And also there's not much point before you have carriers in mass service in a fleet air arm being independent, because they're fighting on land and bombing land targets and providing air defense of land operations. They should be part of a unified command. It makes sense. It then changes, and it's fun times. Anyway, so I hope you've all enjoyed. I hope you found it a useful session. And any more questions before we go? Because I'm going to wrap this up at about the 90-minute mark. Mainly so I'm going to get some more drink. I've now run out of Iron Brew again. I need water this time. All good? Right then, I will post the pictures on Twitter of Henderson. Hang on, another question. The Italian Navy's greatest fear to this day is to have its F-35B absorbed in a joint force lightning like in the UK. They are really, really horrified by the idea. I can see why after Harrier. Yeah, but it also works. It's one of those scenarios. I would love to have a fleet air arm big enough to justify having them all separate, but for that you'd probably need 3 Queen Elizabeth class carriers, and you need to be providing them all with squadrons and all these things. As it is, it's not going to be big enough. They're not going to supply enough money. They're not going to supply enough force. So you need a joint force is the best way to generate it. It's sad, but it's the way it is. And we make the best. Anyway, thank you very much, and take care. Have a nice day. And as I said, please do subscribe. Please do share and tweet about it and all those things, because, as I said, familial bragging rights are at stake. Admiral Paul from Chicago. Admiral Henderson in World War I was instrumental in setting up Convoy. Kind of dangerous for a career. Who was his sponsor in the RN? He had Jellicoe, and Jellicoe was a very big fan of his, and Beatty was also a big fan. He was one of the few officers who united both camps. They really did love him. Thank you, Paul, for the question. HMS Henderson should be a thing. That would be really, really nice. But for that, I'm not sure what would be appropriate for him, as he sort of built he didn't ever get to command in a famous battle as a sort of the fleet commander or anything like that. So it's very hard to make the case for him. Anyway, thank you very much, and have a nice evening. Chat soon. On Thursday, we're looking at destroyers in Norway and all the stuff they get up to in Norway. When do you need to hit 1,000 subscribers by? Well, I would love it to be the end of April, but I doubt that's going to be happen. I just need to get to 1,000 so I can, get the familial bragging rights. Probably end of May, and I'll still get them. Thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you very much, Will. And thank you very much again to Paul. Anyway, take care. And Paul and Brad, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you very much, everyone. And have a nice day. Bye.